Good morning and thank you for attending Police Headquarters. My name is Constable Carolyn DeClute and I am here today to introduce Acting Inspector Ian Nichol of Financial Crimes.
Good morning. In April of 2017, the Toronto Strategic Partnership commenced an investigation called Project Hall. Project Hall involved allegations of fraudulent and extortionate conduct by a group of companies operating out of Toronto that were offering moving services to people across Canada. It's alleged that persons in the employ of companies operating as Green Moving and Rider Moving of Toronto defrauded victims by providing quotes for moving contracts that they had no intention of honoring, providing evidence or false evidence of grossly exaggerated load weights associated to victims' belongings as a ruse to increase costs to victims, holding victims' property in storage outside of their province of residence to be used as leverage and threatening to destroy that property if the victims did not pay the extortionate fees, using aliases and multiple company names in order to mask the identities of scheme participants in order to make recovery difficult for victims. On the 17th of May, investigators from the Toronto Police Service, the RCMP, and the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services executed a criminal code search warrant at a business address in Scarborough associated to Green Moving. Investigators located and seized the property of two families who were moving from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. It's alleged they've been victimized in the fashion that I just described to you. Both families, again, had moved from Alberta to Eastern Canada. On the 24th of May, the accused, Birak Ozgan, 30 years of age, of Toronto, was arrested by police and was charged with the following offences: fraud over $5,000, 2 counts; possession of property obtained by crime over $5,000, 2 counts; and 1 count of extortion. He is scheduled to appear in courtroom 407 at Toronto East Courts on the 4th of July, 2017. He's alleged to have played a significant role in the offences, but he is not believed by investigators to have acted alone. The investigation into the identities of the other suspects continues. Police believe that there are other victims who predominantly reside outside of the province of Ontario. We're asking that persons with recent dealings involving companies operating out of Toronto known as Green Moving, Rider Moving, Landmark Van Lines, or Capital Moving Services, we ask that you contact the Toronto Police Financial Crimes Unit at 416-808-7300 and advise us of your circumstances. We would like to hear from you. Residents of all provinces are reminded to understand their rights under the provincial legislation within their own provinces and to take precautions when contemplating the use of moving services. Related information for people in Ontario, for citizens of Ontario, can be found on the Consumer Protection Ontario homepage. Federally, they can be located on the Office of Consumer Affairs homepage, and within your own province, related information from the relevant ministries can also be located. That's all I have for you, subject to your questions.
Did they actually destroy anything?
That's not part of the allegations. At this point, the allegations are, we're saying they threatened to destroy people's property if they didn't pay fees that were never agreed to.
How much money? How much would they have?
Well, an example of a family that moved from Alberta to Eastern Canada, they agreed to a price of approximately $2,700 for the cost of moving a small 2-bedroom family home with minimal belongings. The price that was quoted was about $2,700. The price that it ultimately was charged, they were told to pay, was $14,000, and that was based on falsified load weights. I believe we weighed the items, or we did weigh the items, and I believe they're in the range of 5,000 pounds as opposed to the 12,000 pounds or so that they were advised it weighed. So that's an example of the tactics that were used in one particular case. We are aware of other complaints, but we would like to hear from those people.
Is Green Moving still in operation? Have you let them continue operating?
They are still in operation. It's difficult at this point for various reasons. I believe there are other victims, but there may also be services that they're conducting where there aren't complaints, and we have to establish which ones may have complaints related to them. There may be some civil issues as well, and we have to decide which one's which.
Is this a kind of common crime, would you say?
I am aware of similar allegations involving this and other companies. This has been a problem for quite some time, and frankly, police services in this province and other provinces often don't know what to do when the complainants approach them, because initially these complaints present themselves as a civil matter. They involve contracts, they involve fees quoted, business arrangements, and so on, which typically do fall under the civil realm. In this case, though, we're alleging that there never was any intention whatsoever on behalf of the accused to actually follow up on these contracts they agreed to. They had no intention of honoring them.
Is this person related at all to Project Overhaul? Because I know that Toronto Police have done these projects in the past with moving companies. Is there any relation?
To the best of my knowledge, there's no relation. We're not alleging that. The investigation will determine if there is any connection.
So the person's possessions you recovered, the one that you weighed, how are they going to get their possessions back? Are they going to have to pay for another moving company to move their possessions?
Are you talking about people that we believe are currently victims or previous victims?
The two victims that you talked about, the one that they tried to extort them for $14,000. So I assume they paid them a certain amount of money already. Are they going to have to pay even more money now to get their goods moved to the East Coast?
We've currently seized the belongings of two families that we are aware of that have moved from Western Canada to Eastern Canada. Those items have been retrieved and are being held in storage off-site. They're not under any obligation to pay any fees beyond what they have already paid, and we're making arrangements to get that property back to the victims.
So you're going to actually move this stuff for them? They don't have to pay for another moving
We're not going to move it for them. The arrangements are being made through their own process.
How many victims do you think there are in total, potentially?
I don't want to speculate about how many victims there are beyond saying that I believe this has been going on for a long time, and I believe there are other victims.
Can you kind of give us a little insight as to how it worked? If this person who was arrested was operating here in Scarborough, how did they get the goods from Alberta or from the West Coast and start to ship them out this way?
There's no limits on one's ability to advertise on the web. Certainly that forms part of the basis of these allegations. There was initial contact over the web. There is difficulty in the regulatory environment with these types of offenses because every province has its own set of legislation regarding moving services. People don't necessarily know who to turn to when they do have a complaint of this nature. So it makes it difficult to investigate.
How would you suggest then people deal with this if they think they're a victim, whether they're in Toronto or elsewhere?
Well, certainly there's a preventative side to this. You really have to do your research when you're going to hire a moving company. For example, you can look on the web all you want and you can look at customer ratings. Those obviously can be faked and quite often they are faked, so I wouldn't rely on them too much. The Better Business Bureau, within the province of Ontario, you can actually look on the Consumer Beware list, which is located at the Ontario Ministry of Government and Consumer Services homepage. There's a lot of information about companies where there have been previous complaints that can be found. If you're going to check references, don't rely again on the web. Actually contact the references yourself. There's a lot of things that you need to be aware of if someone's demanding cash as payment and they're not accepting, the usual forms of payment, credit card, debit card, et cetera. You've got to start wondering what's up with this company. Are they legitimate? And then there's all sorts of offenses that might fall under the regulatory and civil regimes as well. Are they properly insured? Those are questions you have to ask yourself as well.
So you're saying that this guy here in Toronto, Scarborough, can advertise on the web, but he's got to be in collusion somehow with somebody in Alberta, right? Because they're working.
Well, not necessarily. We're not alleging that. I know that in one particular instance, moving arrangements were made, and the company. Well, it's actually it was a company claiming to be the sister company of one of the companies that was hired. Just showed up. That brings up another point. When you're hiring a moving company, you need to have them come and inspect your property at the place that it's going to be moved from and provide you a quote from there rather than accepting a quote over the internet. Legitimate companies, they don't provide you with an official estimate over the web. Victims I am aware of have been duped into believing that this estimate over the internet was valid, and they acted on the basis that was what it was going to cost them. You need to have them inspect the load at the scene. So in this case, the moving company showed up. They just picked up the load and left with it, and the victim only had that estimate that was provided over the internet in order to back up their claim.
Couldn't a legitimate company, though, do that and then at the other end say, well, we still have to charge you more because of the here?
In the province of Ontario, every province has its own legislation that governs moving services, but in the province of Ontario, you're only allowed to, it recognizes that there are incidentals that occur in any moving situation. So you're allowed to go up to 10% over your original estimate, provided there's a valid reason for it. That's provincial legislation. Some provinces have, I think there's no allowance whatsoever to go over, but they've each got their own legislation that deals with that. So the other part of that is that you cannot use a person's property as leverage to renegotiate a price. It's illegal to hold on to it. It's in this particular case, it was property obtained by crime. The victims were duped into believing a contract would be honored, and they had no intention of honoring it, as this is what we're alleging, at which point that property is property obtained by crime. And any attempt to leverage that by threatening to destroy it, we are alleging as extortion.
Did they sign a contract at all?
I beg your pardon?
Did they sign a contract?
There are contracts, and again, the complaints vary, and we are aware of some complaints that charges are not laid where there's been a suggestion of a contract. What constitutes a contract? Is an agreement over the phone a contract? I think technically it is, but how do you prove that? How do you prove an email estimate is a valid estimate versus just a ballpark? You know, those are the sorts of questions that come up.
How long has Green Moving been around now at this point? How many years has it been in operation?
That's a good question. I believe that Green Moving has been around at least for a couple of years, but I also believe that there are other companies associated to them that have been operating for longer than that. And part of the allegations, part of the allegations here is that there's a deliberate effort to confuse consumers by having one company show up to pick up the load that isn't necessarily the same company as the company that you hired. Another company with a different name will charge your credit card for a deposit, for example. That will be somebody else. So at the end, you don't even know who you're dealing with, let alone where your property is. And if you were to try and go, through, civilly through a lawyer, they wouldn't even know where to start because they don't know who they're dealing with.
So the sister companies that are showing up at people's homes, they're all in cahoots with this?
We're alleging in two cases that is the case, and we need to do an investigation to find out just how much more of that may be occurring.
And how many people are employed with Green Moving?
I don't want to estimate that.
And Green Moving,
Well, if the allegations pertain to two victims, we believe there are more, and I don't want to speculate on what the total number is.
you said Green Moving is still operating?
They are still operating. Again, it's difficult for us at this time to state that everything they've ever done is necessarily, or we're not alleging that everything they've ever done is illegal. We're saying in these two cases, the offenses were committed. We believe there may be more. So I'm not in a position at this point to suggest that we have grounds to shut the entire company down. We need to look into this more deeply before we start taking those sorts of steps.
And of those companies that you mentioned, Landmark and so on, is Green Moving the only one that's operated here in Toronto, or the other ones?
All the companies that I mentioned are operating out of Scarborough. And I need to caution you too that there may actually be companies with similar names, both here in Toronto and elsewhere in the country with similar names who are legitimate. So that's something we have to be careful with as well.
The 30-year-old arrested and charged, I'm sorry if you said this, is he the owner and operator here?
He is a person that we've identified as an employee of the company, that we're able to substantiate the allegations. We don't believe that he operated alone, but at this point, he's the person that we have grounds to lay the charges for.
Have you been able to be in contact with the owner of the company, the actual?
I don't want to get too deeply into the investigation.
What sort of building were the items found in?
They were found at a storage facility.
Belonging to Green?
Operated by, yes.
And so if someone believes that they are a victim of this, you're saying that a lot of times it ends up going civil first. Should they call police? Like if they have a concern, should they just call police first and kind of let it be known so that that can be put on the record somehow?
What I'm asking is that people who have had dealings with the companies I mentioned, Green Moving, Capital Moving Services, Landmark, Van Lines, excuse me,
It's okay, and Ryder, is it Ryder?
Pardon me? Yeah, Ryder Moving as well, yes. So if the companies that I'd mentioned, if people who are currently having dealings with those companies, and they believe that they may be a victim, we were asking that they contact us. At this point, we're looking for people who have a current relationship with those companies. We don't necessarily want to talk at this point to everyone who's ever used their services. We need to find out more before we take any further action.
Can I clarify one thing? You said that they don't own the storage facilities, but they operate them, but those facilities would be out of province, where they would keep people's...
In this case, the facility was located in Scarborough, Ontario. So that is a storage facility. So what we're alleging is property is picked up in one province. It's destined for Eastern Canada, but unbeknownst to the victims, it's placed in Scarborough, Ontario. And then that property is used to keep the property, and then that property is in turn being used as leverage to negotiate a higher fee.
But it was like always in the same province.
Well, in the cases that we're alleging, it's being stored in Scarborough. That's not to say that there may not be other facilities as well.
Did the families, did they pay that $14,000 or anything close to it?
In the two victims that we're dealing with, they didn't pay the full fee. One of the victims, I believe, made a deposit. I'm not sure of the amount. In the case of the other one, there was no fee paid.
What about the other citizens? They have a similar experience, but the company they're dealing with is not the companies you mentioned. Just should they approach a police or the small family?
If you believe that you have been a victim of any fraud, I encourage you to approach your local police service. And I will acknowledge that it can be difficult for police because these cases don't necessarily present themselves initially as a criminal allegation. They might present initially as a civil allegation until you look into it in greater depth. So that's one of the problems that people will face. So that also comes down to another tip for consumers is you've got to keep your records so that when you do actually make a complaint of this nature that you've got all of the information. So to ensure that it is not initially dismissed as being a civil complaint. These are very specific allegations. We're not talking about unsound business practices or lack of insurance or things that fall into the civil or the regulatory realm. We're saying that they created a contract they had no intention of honoring. They took people's property on the basis that it would be moved. It never was, not to where they thought it would be, and that they then extorted the people into paying or trying to get them to pay more by threatening to destroy the property. So these are very specific allegations.
Were both families from Alberta?
They were moving from Alberta to Eastern Canada. One was to Nova Scotia, one was to New Brunswick.
Last questions?
Thank you.